Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian at the Ramsey County Libraries, and I deal with our history and current events programming. I'm welcoming you today to J.B. Anderson's presidential series on Abraham Lincoln. We are glad that J.B. is back with us this week, having to cancel last week's talk. JB will fill us in on that. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to JB. And we are so happy that he's with us here again today. Hi, JB.
Hi, thanks. I was in the hospital for 4 days with pneumonia, so I had to cancel last week. But this Monday is the first day I got out. I went to lunch, so feeling much better, but still a bit off. Anyhow, let's get going. First thing that I'm going to talk about was a question from 2 weeks ago about the origin of the term Whig, W-H-I-G. And it is a major political party in the British Parliament. You have Labour, which are very liberal on the socialist side, and you have the Whig Party, which is more conservative. And there's a third party that's very small called the Liberal Party in England. They can become very powerful when there isn't a majority for the Whigs or the Liberal or the Whigs or the Labour Party. Then they get positions in the cabinet and so on, and are the real shapers because they're keeping a party in power through negotiated settlements of some kind. So the term originally was Whigamore, and it was a reference to cattle drivers. They are called drovers, as you see here. And this was a term that was started by people who lived in North England along the Scottish border. And mostly it applies to cattle drivers on the western side of Scotland down at the British border. And it was intended as an ugly term, derisive. It was something that made the Scottish look like they were horrible slime. Here's a close-up of that image that was very small on the last slide. This is a more modern, like in the 1800s, not the 1600s, when this term was Whigamore came to be a derisive term against cattle drivers, this guy. And look at the line of cattle. Here in the US, they would drive these cattle out of Texas, north to Kansas, and there they'd be slaughtered. And of course, there were other destinations also. This became a very difficult situation when farmers started putting up fences, and these cattle could then not be driven, as you see here, walking their way a few hundred miles or 100 miles or so to a new destination. This began during the English Civil Wars. They were a series of wars between Protestants and Catholics. This is Charles I. He was the king of England from 1600 to 1649 when this term came into use, Whigamore. It was shortened to Whig sometime. It was between 1679 and 1681. I'm going to call it 1680. And it was under the reign of King Charles II, pictured here. And he died with no heirs. So there became a difficulty as to who would be the next king. Next in line was his brother, pictured here, James the First, and he was of Scottish origin. That was difficult, and he was a Catholic, and that was difficult because Henry VIII, just 100 years earlier, had created a reformation to Protestantism from Catholicism in England. So the difficulty here is James the First is in essence a foreigner, and he is a Catholic in a Protestant country, but he was allowed to become king. And today we have Charles III, so he's taken up the name of these first two Charleses from 400 years ago. So at any rate, this term got applied to people, Whigs, in a derisive way for cattle drivers in Scotland. And then in England, decades later, it became a derisive term for a group of people who were opposed to the kingship of James the First, pictured here. So Whig became, it grew out of opposition to James the First's first ascension to the throne. And here is Charles III. Okay, end of question. Back to Lincoln. Lincoln had a newspaper, and we're going to talk about that. He bought it in 1859, the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, which means the Illinois State Gazette. It was a German language newspaper located here in Springfield, where Lincoln was from, and right kind of almost in the middle of Illinois. And a German language paper. Now, there were at this time, 1860, in Illinois, there were 1.7 million people in the 1860 Illinois census. 130,000 of them were German speakers. That's 7.6% of the population. Now, they voted heavily for Democrats. Lincoln is a Republican, and he buys this newspaper. Here's a book about this issue, Germans in Illinois, and the fact that, there are a reasonable number of people, 7.6% of the population, could easily swing an election. And this book is by Miranda Wilkerson and Heather Richmond. Lincoln bought the paper secretly. He didn't want anybody to know that a Republican now owned this Democratic or Democrat Party aligned newspaper. And he wanted to change it so it displayed Republican values, and hoping to win over much of the German population to vote Republican in elections. So these German people with this German language newspaper were really being, slid into a Republican philosophy, not knowing who the owner of the paper was, a leading Republican, Abraham Lincoln, in Illinois. Lincoln becomes interested in the presidential race of 1860. There were three issues that really got him interested, even though, he was unknown, didn't have much of a chance. He was known well around Illinois because in 1858, he had run for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, and he lost that race. If you remember from 2 weeks ago, it was the Illinois Senate that voted for who the senators would be, and they were really trying to get the vote of a majority of the Senate, not the people. That changed in 1914. People started electing U.S. senators. Lincoln's concerns in 1860 were an editor of an Illinois newspaper had been killed, and the reason he was killed by a mob was the ideas that he was expressing in his newspaper. He was killed for what he printed. And, of course, the Constitution has freedom of the press in it. So Lincoln was very concerned about someone being killed over an idea that they published, a position or a bias or whatever you may want to call it. Second item that Lincoln was concerned about was the U.S. being very powerful. He wasn't concerned negatively about this. This was a positive thing. One of the issues he talked about was we can defend ourselves very well against foreign threats. Argument is used to this day. It's why we have a very strong military. Half the United States budget is military in nature, and it's really more than that. There are many items that are military oriented that aren't included under the military budget. Some say that about 2/3 of the United States budget goes to the U.S. military. And the third item, a black man was burned to death in Illinois, and Lincoln was concerned about this. It's okay for blacks to live among us. Some of them are free, but they do not deserve to be murdered or lynched or whatever. There were about 4,000 lynchings during the Jim Crow era, which was from the late 1860s into the 1960s, almost 100 years. 4,000 lynchings of blacks, mostly throughout the South. The 1860 presidential nomination we're going to talk about next. First, an introduction. Lincoln started campaigning after he lost the Senate race in 1858. So he's got 2 years here in preparation for running for president or the presidential nomination of the Republican Party. Here's a piece of sheet music that was put out in his favor, Lincoln Campaign Songster. And there'd usually be someone playing a musical instrument, and you'd be making a speech, but you'd be singing a song. So the entire audience that had gathered to hear a speech in these days would do some singing first and last. And from 1858 to 1860, Lincoln averaged 21 speeches a month. 30 days in a month, he's spending 2/3 of all the days in a month giving a speech somewhere in Illinois. This involved a great deal of travel. Here you see him reading a book while a horse is taking him to a new city to deliver a speech. Sometimes he took a train, depended on how far away it was, whether trains were available to the town that he was wanting to speak in next, but mostly the travel was on railroads, not by horse and cart, as you see here. Horace Greeley is the next item we're going to discuss in the 1860 presidential nomination. there's on the right here is a political cartoon. They make him look butt ugly. He's a guy that had neck whiskers. See here. These were somewhat popular during the latter 1800s. You shave your face, but you leave the whiskers on your neck to grow. He was very critical of Abraham Lincoln. He was not a candidate for the presidency. Well, what the heck? Who is he then? He's founder and editor of the New York Tribune. So a lot of population out on the East Coast, lots of people reading this newspaper of Horace Greeley's, and he does editorials about candidates. This newspaper existed from 1841 until 1966. And what you see here in the graphic is the header of the newspaper, and it's from June 16th of 1860. So Greeley was a journalist, controlled what was in this New York Tribune newspaper. Cost $2 a year, see here. My wife gets paper delivered every day. We pay $630 for it, and that's like $1.83 a day. Now in 1860, this is $2 a year. By inflation in 2024, that would be $76. The Minnesota Star Tribune, we pay $670 for. That's $1.84 per day. I think I said $630 earlier, and $1.83. Anyhow, the daily cost of the newspaper is almost the yearly cost in 1860 of this New York Tribune. That was owned by Greeley. Greeley's most famous quote in his newspaper was "Go west, young man." But by west, he didn't mean California, Nevada, Utah, places like that. West in 1860 was Ohio. He was talking about people getting into Ohio, and they have great farmland there and so forth. So west is a term that is indicative of the date. So in 1860, the West isn't very far west from the Atlantic Ocean. It isn't on the Pacific side of the United States. So "Go west, young man" meant see you in Ohio. Lincoln was pretty well accepted in the Midwest. He'd gotten to be well known. But on the East Coast, Lincoln was not very well known. This is a photo of Greeley here, and you can see his neck whiskers popping out. And so the East, anyway, is territory that is largely controlled by Greeley and his newspaper in terms of getting information out. So it's quite a different situation along the East Coast compared to the Midwest, where Lincoln had developed a very good following. Greeley had two concerns about Lincoln that were published in his newspaper. He's willing to compromise on slavery. This was a negative issue for Greeley. Greeley was an abolitionist. He wanted slavery ended, and Lincoln was making speeches about how can we compromise on this? How can we do slow emancipation, etc. Second concern that Greeley had was Lincoln had never said anything about the Dred Scott decision on slavery. Dred Scott had sued his owner, who was a medical doctor, and they were stationed, amazingly, at Fort Snelling here in Minnesota for 3 years. Dred Scott returned to Missouri, a slave state, with his medical doctor owner, and actually the owner and a brother of the owner supported Dred Scott suing for his freedom because he'd been in a free state for 3 years. Supreme Court struck it down. Slaves can't sue anybody. They are property. It'd be like your chair suing you, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So Lincoln chose to say nothing about this monumental decision, to this day considered, one of the huge decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. This is the Dred Scott burial site. It's at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. This marker was placed there on October 2nd of 2023. That's not a mistake. Don't mean 1923. It's 2023. So this guy with this monumental decision was in an unmarked grave for many decades. Now, just roughly 13 months ago, this monument was placed at the cemetery where he is buried. Greeley was a liberal Republican. Now, notice liberal is capitalized here. This was a separate party from the Republican Party. So it doesn't mean he was in the Republican Party and was a liberal. Greeley was in a third party called the Liberal Republican Party. He was also supportive of Democrats. In 1872, Greeley was nominated for the presidency. Ulysses Grant was running for a second term. Greeley lost the election. Grant won a second term. So Greeley had gotten the nomination and was one of the major candidates in that 1872 election. And it was well known because he was the publisher of a newspaper. Lincoln's Cooper Union speech is our next topic. We're still talking about the 1860 presidential nomination. Cooper Union is a building in the south of Manhattan. It was built in 1859. This is a recent photograph of it. I have walked past that building. My wife and I spent 2 summers living in New York City. I think I've been there at least a dozen times, maybe 3 or 4 times doing research for the University of Minnesota on Hubert Humphrey in particular. There was an industrialist that built this building. His name was Peter Cooper. And this building is a major attraction architecturally and because of its history. Lincoln spoke here when he was campaigning for the presidency or campaigning for the Republican nomination, at any rate. Here's another net whiskers guy. This is Peter Cooper, who built the building. And he was an industrialist, lots of money. So see, got them whiskers down on the neck. Today, the building is an architecture, engineering, and art school. And it's at 30 Cooper Square in the south of Manhattan, near the Bowery. Here's Bowery Avenue. Here's Museum of Ice Cream. I'll tell you, they got everything you can imagine in New York City. Here's a Washington Square Park. There's a hotel over here that I stayed in for a couple of nights, and there's a park across the street. And right about here was Dustin Hoffman's house. Here is the Cooper Union building on Cooper Square, it's called. And here is Russian and Turkish baths building. This Bowery was always interesting to me, even though I never walked down there. I wish I had. It was interesting to me because as a kid in the 1950s watching TV, they would play movies from the 1940s called The Bowery Boys. And I used to watch those movies, and it was about this gang of guys that lived in this Bowery area, and the father ran a kind of a drugstore. Interesting little series, anyway. Anyway, this is the place where Lincoln made this famous Cooper Union speech. And Washington Square Park over here, loaded with statues of famous people. Chester Alan Arthur, when he became president, he was vice president. James Garfield died. He lived, I think it was up here roughly. He took the oath of office for president when Garfield died at that home. There's a marker on the place. 5 major elements in the Cooper Union speech of Lincoln's. First, he stated that popular sovereignty was something that the founding fathers had been opposed to. They did not like that idea. That's people deciding issues. So you would vote on whether or not your state should have slavery. Slavery is a human rights issue, not a majority rules issue, which is what popular sovereignty would be. You know, a lot of people think democracy is about the majority rules. That's true in elections. It's not true in the rights of people. This is where individuals rule. So the concern was individuals voting on an issue such as slavery. That's really a human rights issue. It's an individual issue. It's not a community issue. Second item that Lincoln delivered in this speech is there should be no expansion of slavery into U.S. territories. Now, here is February 14th to February 8th of 1860. This is a map of the United States. Everything in orange here is territories. You can see at least a third, maybe more than that, of what the United States owned in 1860 was territories. This one's unorganized. Nebraska, Washington, Utah, New Mexico, Kansas, and Indian Territory. And here's a neutral strip that eventually became a part of Utah as a state. So this is a tremendous amount of United States territory. And Lincoln in this speech states, slavery should not exist in any of these U.S. territories, which the states' rights people throughout the South here didn't like. They wanted one free state coming into the Union for every slave state that comes into the Union. So you'd maintain a balance of slave states and free states. And here Lincoln is stating no new states in these territories can have slavery. Morality is the major argument against slavery, was Lincoln's third major point in the Cooper Union speech. Now, he did not say politics was a major issue against slavery. He didn't say it was an economic issue. He said it was a moral issue. Oh, number 4, made some comments about the South and slavery and showed differences between Democrats and Republicans, with Democrats being far more supportive of slavery. Republicans in their 1856 campaign arguments, they said abolish slavery, 1856. So you had a clear division here between the Republicans and Democrats on the slavery issue. It's interesting because eventually these parties would switch. Democrats in the 1960s were the giant advocates for the end of Jim Crow laws throughout the South, for instance. So anyway, fourth major item in the speech is about the South and slavery and what's going to happen with that. Anyhow, these positions that he's talking about aren't the ones I showed on that graphic. They are gymnastics or dance positions. Fifth and final major speech issue for Lincoln at Cooper Union: slavery cannot be ended where it already exists, but it can be stopped from expanding. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He was a non-expansionist. The Cooper Union speech was very lengthy for Lincoln. He made pretty short speeches. He did not have a great speaking voice, high, squeaky. It was 7,000 words in length, took 25 minutes. Most speakers in 1860, 30,000 words, and the speech took 2 hours. This was a tremendous amount of entertainment for people. People would come from all around when a major politician was making a speech. It was like Saturday night barn dances. It was an opportunity for people to get together. Consequently, speeches were very lengthy. Often there was more than one speaker. People would bring a lunch, and one speaker would end after a couple hours, and they'd shake off their blanket and put it down and get ready for the next speaker. But Lincoln was not one of these great speakers. Most of his speeches were minutes in length. Gettysburg Address is like 3 minutes. This particular Cooper Union speech, which was a big deal because it was in the East in New York, and attended by many people, was 25 minutes in length. Here is Cooper Union Hall here, drawing of Lincoln making this Cooper Union speech. Here's a book about the Cooper Union speech, Lincoln at Cooper Union, by Harold Holzer, a famous historian. This book is available online. You can order it through any bookstore if you're interested in greater details about this speech. Next item we're going to discuss is the United States patent that was issued to Lincoln. This is a boat. You had to submit a model when you asked for a patent. And this is Lincoln's model, and this is a ship. And the ship like this sinks, say, in the Mississippi River. How do you get it up and out of the way? Lincoln invented these canvas bags that you see attached here, and they'd be inflated with air and would refloat the ship, so you could then get it onto land and dismantle it. Lincoln, to this day, is the only president of the United States to have been issued a patent. This model submission like this was required, and again, a little more close up, you can see these canvas bags were Lincoln's idea. Pump air into them, and you raise the sunken ship. The 1860 presidential election, I gotta check the time occasionally here. 1860 presidential election. First set of slides are an introduction. The Republican Party was founded in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. Here's where we are, Minneapolis area. You can take 94 to 82 and across, and here is Ripon, Wisconsin, where the Republican Party was founded. First presidential candidate in 1856 was former General John C. Fremont. Here's Milwaukee, Fond du Lac, here's Green Bay, and there is Ripon, Wisconsin. Now, 160 years later, we've been getting ripped on ever since, according to anti-Republicans. often they'll say we're being ripped off, but ripped on sounds more like the city where the party was founded. So occasionally you'll hear somebody say, we're getting ripped on, meaning they're opposed to the Republican Party. The first party platform, 1856, called for the abolition of slavery. The graphic here is a drawing of John C. Fremont, the first presidential candidate of the Republican Party. And here he is in military uniform. He was an explorer for the military, moved throughout the United States, just describing places, what the Native Americans were like in the area. Was there anything that might be of wealth, mineral ores, for instance, places to build forts? He was looking for all of that sort of stuff. There's a rock at this site in Minnesota where he wintered over, and they all carved their names, the people, in a rock. This is just one portion of the rock, and I can't find a photo that I took. And another part of the rock has a very big signature, and it is J.B. Andersen, S-O-N on the end, minus S-E-N. But I can't find a picture of it, and I took one even. Anyhow, interesting spot. The Pipestone National Monument is where this rock is located, and where Fremont and his group of explorers left their names and dates on the rock. Native American mining site today, and was back then also. It's now Blue Mound State Park is nearby. They would mine a red stone, pipestone it's called, to make peace pipes with. Another place to visit there is the state park, Blue Mound, and nearby the Jeffers petroglyphs. These are a huge area rock formation on the ground, and Native Americans have carved images into the rocks there. Another great place to visit. Here is Pipestone. The Jeffers petroglyphs are more over in this area here, but this is the Pipestone National Monument here, and still being mined by Native Americans. Great place to visit. It'd be an overnight thing. It's a ways. You got to go all the way to the South Dakota border, but very interesting stuff to look at there. The Fremont layover there during an exploring expedition, the mining of pipestone, etc. Laverne, Minnesota is a little town nearby. They have cactus at this state and national monument. Pretty interesting. You walk through there and there's cactus in Minnesota. Also, Frederick Manfred's home. He's a Western novel writer. Many of you may be familiar with some of his books if you read novels about the Old West. Here is a picture of Manfred. Here's a couple of these books, Riders of Judgment, The Manly Hearted Woman. He's got a total of 51 books that he published with this Western novel theme. And his house is a site there in that Jeffers petroglyphs area. So you can visit his house. Also, very famous Minnesota novelist among people who read about the Old West. Here are some of the Jeffers petroglyphs. Here's where Jeffers, Minnesota is located. Here's where Pipestone is at. These are 10,000, some of them are 10,000-year-old carvings. They go up to an end about 200 years ago. So it's a very lengthy 10,000 year set of markings, and you can see the really old ones are more faded, and the ones 200 years old are still very much visible. And it's a large area, very interesting. So interesting spot to visit. Stop in Jeffers and then continue on to Pipestone. Republican hopefuls in 1860. Number one is Lincoln, but he was a big dark horse. He's what's called today a favorite son. In other words, at the Democratic Party convention or the Republican Party convention, a state might nominate one of its congressmen or one of its senators, and they are a favorite son from that state with no chance of winning the nomination, but they get to say, hey, I ran for the presidential nomination in 2024 as a favorite son from Massachusetts or wherever. So Lincoln was not expected to get the nomination in 1860. Dark horse candidate, favorite son of the state of Illinois. But the convention was in Illinois, it was in Chicago. That gave Lincoln and his supporters a good deal of extra control over the nomination process. Notice here now, this is 1860. Lincoln does not have a beard. And at the time of his nomination in 1860, no beard. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Republican National Convention was in Chicago. This is the man that was expected to be the nominee of the Republicans in 1860, William Seward. He lost the nomination to Lincoln, but ended up a member of Lincoln's cabinet and very famous for the purchase of Alaska. Purchased Alaska from Russia, and it's just a big frozen area. Came to be known as Seward's Folly because, I mean, who would want such a place? Can't do anything up there. It's all frozen year round, permafrost. 1867 is when this happened, so it was 2 years after the Lincoln assassination. Seward was a cabinet member in Lincoln's replacement, Andrew Johnson, when this purchase occurred, and was the expected nominee in 1860. Salmon P. Chase, pictured here, was another candidate that people thought had a lot of notice. Anyway, the issue is who would name their kid after a fish? Anyhow, Salmon P. Chase. In 1864, Lincoln was worried that Chase would attempt to get the Republican nomination that Lincoln wanted. So Lincoln appointed him that year, early in that year, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That would basically keep him from running for president. So Lincoln got rid of a major candidate against him by appointing him to the Supreme Court. Chase had an exceptionally beautiful daughter. His wife had died. His daughter would accompany him everywhere. This gave him a great deal of attention. People would talk to him, but were really interested in talking with his daughter. This is Edward Bates, another candidate for the Republican nomination. He was in the House of Representatives, and his seat that he gained was an area in the state of Missouri, which was a slave state. He became Lincoln's attorney general when Lincoln won the 1860 election. Simon Cameron, another major candidate in 1860, was a United States Senator from the state of Pennsylvania. He became the Secretary of War in the Lincoln cabinet. It's interesting that we use that term war up until Harry Truman was president. Then we changed it to the less divisive term defense. So our secretaries of war in the past are today called secretaries of defense. Makes it sound like we have a military just to defend ourselves, not to go to war, hence the name change. This is William L. Dayton. He wanted to be, he was the vice presidential nomination in 1856. John C. Fremont was the president nominated by the Republicans, but lost the election. Dayton was a candidate in 1860 for the presidential nomination. He was from the state of Missouri, New Jersey. John McLean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, all these people we've never heard of, and they were major league leaders in the Republican Party in its early years in the 1850s and 60s. He was in the U.S. House of Representatives. He became the United States Postmaster General. Then he served on the Ohio Supreme Court and then was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Note in the photo here, fingerprints on this photo. Somebody touched it in the wrong place. So that was Republican Party candidates, quite a grouping, some from the South, some from mostly from the North, because the Republicans were opposed to slavery. Okay, how about other parties in 1860? Not Republican parties. The Democratic Party had split into a Southern Party and a Northern Party. So you had the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats. On your left here is John C. Breckinridge. He received the nomination of the Southern Democratic Pro-Slavery Party. Stephen Douglas here on the right, senator from Illinois, beat Lincoln in that 1858 Senate election in the Illinois State Senate that voted for senators in those days. So he was the U.S. Senator from Illinois at the time. Douglas County, where Alexandria, Minnesota is located. You can drive up past St. Cloud, you get to Alexandria, and that's Douglas County. It's named for Stephen Douglas, pictured here, a major figure in the Democratic Party in the 1850s and 60s. This is John Bell, Constitutional Union Party. He wanted, you move slow on slavery. You can't secede from the Union. He was opposed to that. There was talk in the 1860s about states seceding, becoming a separate nation. As a candidate, he said, no, you can't secede. And he also was a you don't just end slavery bingo. It's got to be slow emancipation. Republican Party convention in 1860. Hang on. Just checking the time here. The Republican Party convention was in Chicago here. And you can see it's in the far northern part of Illinois. Lincoln was from down here in Springfield, central Illinois. But it's Lincoln's home state. That's a major advantage for Lincoln. He can pack the galleries with people who support him. They don't have to come very far in order to attend the convention. Lincoln had worked hard for this convention to be held in Illinois, where he felt he would gain a great deal of support, even though he was considered a minor candidate. The ballots at the Republican Party convention, You can see William Seward is leading on the first ballot with 173 votes. You need 234 votes for nomination. 5 candidates. Nobody reached that 234 votes. Lincoln gains a great deal, about 79 votes here on the second ballot. Seward gains just 11 votes. Still not nobody anywhere near 34. You can see Cameron lost 48 votes, Chase lost 7, and 13 lost by Bates. Then on the third ballot, major switches begin to occur. Lincoln gets 350 votes. That's way over the 234 needed for nomination. Seward goes down to 111 votes. So on the third ballot, Lincoln is named the second Republican Party nominee in 1860. The Republican Party convention. 4 reasons Lincoln was nominated. He had an excellent campaign team. He'd put together quite an organization. They didn't all have to go to New York or New Jersey for the convention. They could stay very near where Lincoln had formed them together as a team, get up to Chicago very easily on a train, etc. So this is a campaign team, not an athletic team. Second, he was conservative, or some people would say moderate, on slavery. Lincoln was born in the slave state of Kentucky. That made him look good to slave states. His moderation on slavery made him look good to slave states. The pre-Civil War slavery crisis, that was a huge issue at the time. No states had seceded yet, but what are we going to do about it? Again, Lincoln gains this nomination. You can see in this photograph, no beard. He called for internal improvements. You know, when he was a local person there in Springfield and running for local political office, he wanted that river improved that ran through the Springfield area. So internal improvements was a big issue for Lincoln, first in his home area and then nationally. So he's calling at the convention for improvements in roads, canals, railroads, big boon to corporations. I mean, the United States government basically paid for the laying of railroad lines all across the U.S. Railroads, shipping, iron mining, manufacturing, these were all corporations. Lincoln had worked for many of them as an attorney and was very supportive of them during this campaign. And his support came by and large in the form of U.S. government subsidies for things they needed, that these corporations needed to do. Here's a map before the Lincoln presidency. You can see here very few roads, very few canals. These are canals. Not a lot of transportation in these areas here. So more roads, more canals, more railroads, big issue in the 1860s, especially in the 1860 election. Fourth item that Lincoln favored was high tariffs. These are items that are imported from other countries, and they make them much cheaper in England than they can in the United States. So the British products come in and they sell cheaper. Well, if you put a tax on them, you're a foreign country coming into our country, we're going to tax you for everything that you bring in to the United States. that raises the price of their products so that they become more expensive than the products made in the United States. You're protecting US manufacturers. Today, we're doing just the opposite. We allow no tariffs on companies that are based in the US, but everything they make is in China. Made in China, made in India, made in Indonesia. That gets to come in free, no tariffs on those products because the company is located in the United States, but its manufacturing is in Asia. And here you can see this is a tax on tea that they're talking about here, tariff. Tax imposed by one country on the goods and services imported from another country to influence it, raise revenues, protect competitive advantages. So high tariffs. Most people approved of these tariffs, of course. Their jobs were dependent on it, on these products being made more expensive that came from foreign countries. Here's a political cartoon, socialism for the rich. And that's what high tariffs were considered by opponents to tariffs. Capitalism for the rest of the people, socialism for the rich in this political cartoon. Most people approved of the tariffs. It meant their jobs were secure. Many argue that it shouldn't be called capitalism, socialism for the wealthy. And these were issues in Lincoln's day. The United States was beginning to have a lot more manufacturing. I mean, the economic growth from the end of the Civil War to the year 1900, 1865 to 1900, was massive. The richest people in the history of our country are still some named from that latter third of the 19th century because there were no taxes on their incomes. So that's many of those people like Carnegie were worth as much as Elon Musk is today by inflation. Democratic Party nomination or the 1860 presidential election. We're going to take a look at the Democratic Party. Democrats had two conventions. Remember, they were kind of divided between North and South, Southern Democrats, Northern Democrats. One was in Charleston, South Carolina, here, and they could not reach a decision as to a candidate. No one was getting enough votes, a 2/3 majority. The Northern faction of the Democratic Party had its convention here in Baltimore, Maryland, a slave state. And Stephen Douglas was nominated for the presidency by the Northern Democrats. Remember, this is the same guy that ran in 1858 for the Illinois Senate seat against Abraham Lincoln. So here are the ballots for the Democratic Party in the South. And look at this, 57 ballots. You need a 2/3 majority, 155 votes. Douglas on the 57th ballot still had, needed 3.5 more votes to gain the nomination. James Guthrie, pictured here, had 65 votes. Robert Hunter, pictured here, had 16 votes from these Southern Democrats. Here these are the first and second ballots at the Baltimore Convention. Again, the same candidates with the exception here, Stephen Douglas, similar candidate, then James Guthrie and John Breckinridge. And you can see on the first ballot, Douglas had 173, 181 on the second ballot. 202 votes were required for nomination. Nobody could gain that. So the convention just simply said, we're going to get rid of the 2/3 rule. Douglas wins, he's got the most votes. Southern Democrats, the Constitutional Union Party. They're a pro-slavery party, but look, the name, interesting name with a Constitutional Union, meaning maintain the Union. And they nominated Breckinridge, pictured here, Southern Democratic Party. The Constitutional Union Party nominated this gentleman, John Bell. It was a pro-slavery party and also favoring maintenance of the Union. The Wide Awakes Party was a youth movement, really wasn't a political party. It was started by Lincoln. He wanted to get young people out voting. Their voter status was very low. So Lincoln started a special campaign, put out a magazine trying to get the support of young voters in this 1860 election. We hear a good deal about this today, especially in this most recent election. We heard about how many young people will vote, people between 18 and 30, they could make a difference, etc. Many of them are, oh, the heck with it. Many of them are, wow, I finally get to vote, etc. This was an issue in Lincoln's day. Wide Awakes youth movement. See, here's a Republican Wide Awakes. In other words, pay attention, get out and vote. And this is Elmira city or county area, and this pamphlet was released there in an attempt to get people out to vote for Republicans. Republican campaign strategy in 1860. There were 3 procedures. Lincoln, make no campaign speeches. They told him, just don't do it. And that was pretty common in this day. Occasionally people would campaign, but it was considered unseemly. It wasn't until the early 1900s that candidates really started campaigning, crisscrossing the country, using railroads, planes hadn't been invented yet, etc. So no campaign speeches, because you might make people angry on one side of the issue. So here's Lincoln with his mouth closed. You can't speak during this campaign. Not an uncommon thing during the 1800s, but his advisors were worried that the pro-slavery people might not like his ideas, even though they were, slow movement toward emancipation, leave slavery alone where it already exists. But he was a non-expansionist, and that would be bad news for the pro-slavery folks. Print material is the primary way that political parties campaigned during the 1800s. Here they put out a issue like this. People would gather in the town square. This would be on a board that was in the town business area, maybe a variety of places. There'd be somebody that could read. They would stand and read all this information. People that were non-readers could listen. And so this is how campaigning occurred during 1860. Newspapers, posters such as the one you see here, and leaflets, things you would hand out to people. I remember as a kid go downtown with my mother, and if it was during an election season, there'd be people downtown handing out a single sheet for a candidate. And third procedure, have the people that are campaigning for Lincoln should tell his life story. Started out in poverty, advanced himself, became an attorney. Wonderful story about how you can become somebody in the United States. That's a place where this sort of thing is possible. And we still hear these stories today. There's been some criticism of Trump because he inherited $400 million. So among some people, this issue of rags to riches is still important. It shows that you did something with your life, especially if you've got gigantic ears, as depicted in this political cartoon. What are we doing? Okay. Lincoln slogans during the 1860 presidential election. Spent his early life as a rail splitter. That's making the boards that the track for the railroads would lay on the rail, and also fencing. So the rail candidate, but it got switched to the rail splitter, and that became a famous slogan for Lincoln during the 1860 campaign. Second item was you need a nickname, and they thought they could gain something from his physical appearance. Tall, very tall, I mean 6 feet 4 inches. The average height in 1860 of males was 5'6". This would be like a guy 7 feet tall today. So what can we do? What can we say about this guy? Nothing in this category of slogans that Lincoln advisors came up with ever stuck. So there's nothing about his physical appearance that has survived as a campaign slogan. Honest Abe was the third slogan, and that became the most famous, still used commonly today, gained a tremendous amount of popularity. People would wear these buttons, Honest Abe of the West. He was from Illinois, that's way out west, not from the east. Lincoln didn't like this. He didn't like nicknames. He wanted to be called Abraham, not Abe, no shortening of his name, etc. And yet, it has lived through the decades as a major marker for Lincoln, Honest Abe. Here are some slogans from U.S. history. 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And that Harrison was Tippecanoe. He'd been a military general and fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe, so he gained that nickname. 1844, James K. Polk. 5440 or fight. The current U.S. border is way below 54 degrees 40 minutes. This would have made the U.S. all the way up to Alaska. And Polk's campaign slogan of 5440 or fight was, we got to gain all that territory up there in Canada. 1852, we poked you in 44, we shall pierce you in 52. So James K. Polk, we poked you in 44. Now Franklin Pierce is the candidate. We shall pierce you in 52. 1864, this is Lincoln running for a second term. Don't change horses midstream. Very famous slogan from a U.S. election. Don't change horses midstream. And then 1872, grant us another term, and the candidate was Ulysses Grant. So he uses his name in his campaign slogan. 1900, McKinley, 4 more years of a full dinner pail. Kind of an economic issue. prosperity during my first term. I'm running for a second term, and he got elected. 1916, he kept us out of war, Wilson. World War I had started in 1914. At the time, it was called the Great War. There was no World War II yet. So how could there be a World War I? So this was the Great War. And of course, Wilson won using this phrase, and a year later got us into the war. 1924, keep cool and keep Coolidge, using Coolidge's name. So stay relaxed. 1928, Herbert Hoover's campaign slogan, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage. Again, economic issues, which lots and lots and lots of people today say is always the major issue in any presidential campaign. 1932, happy days are here again. FDR, it's a song. And it became, in 1932, this was sung at campaign rallies for Franklin Roosevelt. Another song in 1948, I'm Just Wild About Harry. Very popular song in the 1940s, and Truman's first name. Then the rhyming of 1952, I like Ike. And the last part of like is Ike. So I like Ike. 1964, all the way with LBJ, it rhymes. So campaign slogans became very popular items during the presidential elections. And don't hear so much about them recently. I'm wondering if this is a good time to go to questions yet.
We do have some, so we can ask. Let's see.
I can unshare. I go to escape. Okay.
Okay. Someone's saying, maybe you've covered this already, but where did the money come from for Lincoln to be able to purchase a newspaper and allow a full-time campaigning for 2 years pre-1860?
Well, there were donors. Campaigns cost a whole lot less back then. Recently and most famously, there was a Senate candidate, and I can't think of his name, from Wisconsin. He would always advertise, I spent $140 on my campaign, because he was spending almost nothing. You've got television and radio to aid you. You don't have to travel around. You see these ads. All of a sudden, we have billion-dollar campaigns. And that just wasn't the situation in the 1800s. Candidates generally did not campaign, so no money was required for them to be traveling around. And you had local people who supported them. They didn't need money. They didn't have to travel. They would speak in their city, get large crowds in their village, and speak for their candidate. So there just wasn't a tremendous amount of money needed in the 1800s. It was really under McKinley and his campaign manager that a lot of campaigning started. A lot of money had to be spent for railroad stuff. McKinley's campaign manager said, we're not going to make you travel. What we'll do is we'll bring in people to your house in Ohio on the railroad. So they would pay the way for a carload of people. They'd get off the railroad car, walk 3 blocks to McKinley's home. McKinley would come out onto his porch and make a speech, and these people would go back onto the train and home again. And that was a big deal because you got to ride a train. And, that wasn't something most people were doing, even when trains were first coming about. It was expensive. People didn't travel a great deal. It was for shipping, not for passengers. And so in the 1900 election, we really started spending money.
On campaigning. Well, how about by purchasing the newspaper? Was that something Lincoln did himself out of his own cash, or was that?
Yes, he did it secretly. He did it himself. Lincoln had a tremendous amount of money. Lincoln was making about $100,000 a year in the 1850s. That's about $4.5 million a year today by inflation. So, yeah, Lincoln had lots of bucks.
And was that from working for as a lawyer for corporations?
Yes,
Okay.
primarily railroads. And I had earlier, I don't remember, it might have been the second day uh, of this series of speeches. I talked about Lincoln. There was one railroad company paying him, I've forgotten how much it was, a tremendous amount of, I think it was like $17,000 a year.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, Lincoln was super wealthy.
Okay. Would you say that the meaning of what the Republican and Democratic Party believe has been switched in the years since Lincoln's time?
Yes, absolutely. Uh, the Republican Party became the anti-slavery, pro-rights party, and they flip-flopped, the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats were all across the South. The South voted for Democrats en masse because they were favorable toward slavery. Well, that switched. I mean, think about the 1960s.
Mhm.
Democrats were the civil rights party. The Republicans were, whoa, slow down a little bit. And yeah, that all changed through the early 1900s. And the political parties basically took over each other.
Okay, so I have somebody who said let's see, it was Senator William Proxmire from
Oh, that's
Wisconsin.
right. Yeah, thank you.
So that was one of our,
He was a guy that spent no money.
yeah, that was from one of the viewers here. Gave us that information. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Let's see. Also, wondering because you were out last week, so this would be number 5 of 7 talks. This also goes into something else. I don't think we're gonna make up the missed one, this one, because it would end up being the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving. That's just, it's not, doesn't work well for Ollie or us. So instead, you're gonna continue in the winter with more Lincoln. Is that the plan for? So we're going
Yeah.
to be continuing Lincoln in the winter series. And I don't know if the catalog has come out yet for the winter.
I haven't received it yet, but
So,
yeah.
but that will be the series that we'll be having in the winter for JB. So this in essence then is, this is number 5 of 6 that we're going to be doing this fall. We won't make up that 7th one. We'll be able to cover it material in the winter. So that is the next series.
Yeah, if I can make a comment here,
Mhm.
sorry about that, but it's the second class I've missed in almost, I think it's 19 or 20 years I've been doing this since I retired. And it's the second time I've missed due to an illness. And we just do not make up a class like that. I canceled a class once because there was 10 inches of snow.
Yes.
And, we didn't make that up either. So sorry, and I know especially those of you from the university are paying money to take these classes, and we're down one. End of story, I guess. So
Right. So, one of the things then someone's asking about registering when Ollie releases their winter term catalog, I will have, for those of you watching from the library, I will have that up on our library website for registering on our side of things. And we'll do that And I also realized I had sent out an email to all of my library watchers out there with links to some things that you'd referred to. And I can always see about sending that to Carmi if people are interested, who is one of our OLLI colleagues, and have her forward that information out to people if they want to get some of those links that we talked about in previous sessions. Um, okay, anyone
Right.
else have questions at the moment? Because at the moment it's
Oh,
just asking about upcoming events.
I can also just speak to the end here if
Okay,
need be. Do a few more slides.
sure. We got 9 minutes, so did you
Okay.
just get a question? Oh, just a thank you. So so feel free to go ahead, JB.
Okay. I need to, let's see, I need to share the screen again. Okay, back to the lecture. Hoop-de-doo. 1860 presidential election we're talking about. We're going to take a look at the results. And all the states in red, and look, all in the North voted for Lincoln. All the states in blue voted for Douglas. He won the state of Missouri. End of story. Amazing. All the green states, the entire South, all the slave states went to Breckinridge. And the orange states here, they're the northern southern states. They're Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Went to Bell. These were both third-party candidates, Breckinridge and Bell. You can also see Lincoln won California and Oregon. And so the Republicans basically were a guaranteed winner because the Democrats had split themselves into three parties, uh, especially between the North and the South. So Lincoln was a shoe-in, basically. Here is the candidate, Lincoln, Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas. Here's the electoral votes they got. Lincoln got 180 electoral votes, 59%. So that's a majority. Breckinridge got 72 or 24%. Bell got 39 or 13%. Douglas just got 12 votes from the single state of Missouri for 4%. Now, this is stunning stuff. Lincoln wins the election with 1.9 million votes, under 40% of the voters, 39.8%. 848,000 votes for Breckinridge, 18.1%, and 591,000 votes for Bell, 12.6%. But look at this, 1.4 million for Douglas. And then he won only one state though, 29.5% of the popular vote. And here's the vote totals again. Douglas, 29.5% of the popular vote, but only 4% of the electoral votes. So Lincoln is the winner. Democrats have 46% of the popular vote, 8% more than Lincoln. That's these three together. This is the lowest winning popular vote percentage in United States history. Lincoln, we can say, was our least popular elected president in 1864. Wilson received 41.8% of the vote in 1912. The Republicans were split. They were running William Howard Taft, and then Roosevelt wanted a third term, and he ran in the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. Consequently, the Republican votes were split, and Wilson won with just 41.8%. Nixon in 68 had just 43.4% and won the election. And that's because the Democrats were split. Hubert Humphrey ran against Nixon in 68, but the Democrats again were split. In the South, George Wallace was running for the presidency. He won the South, so denying popular votes and electoral votes to Hubert Humphrey. So again, big type in red, Lincoln won with the lowest popular vote percentage in U.S. history. The 1860 election was regional in the extreme. 15 southern states. Lincoln got no votes in 10 of them. Can you imagine that? A major candidate, 10 states, he receives 0 votes. 15 southern states have 996 counties. Lincoln won 2 counties in the South. Amazing. I mean, it's regional. Blue in the North, red in the South. Were any Lincoln votes thrown out? Did Lincoln voters stay home? Votes were cast publicly here, not secretly. It was the 1890s before we had secret ballots. So you'd fill out your ballot and then you'd go to one of these deposit things. This one might be for Republicans. This one's for Democrats. This one's for Constitutional Union. Everybody in there could see who you were voting for. We stopped that in the 1890s. That originated in Australia, the secret ballot, and then spread worldwide, including to the United States.
So I think that's going to be where we stop then,
Okay,
Jane.
great. Good. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
So yeah, it was a good place to stop, and glad that you are feeling better, that you made it through, and can just hope for your continued improvement. We want to thank Grayson Simmons with OLLI for his help in recording these sessions and dealing with technical issues. And we thank all of you for showing up today and just learning and sharing your questions with us so that we can all learn together. So thanks, everyone. Have a good week.